I knew a minister who once said that a sermon is 18 minutes in which to wake the dead. Now, some ministers might say, well, it takes 25 minutes to wake the dead. And there might be others that say, well, it takes an hour. Well, I would think people listening to an hour sermon might wake up and fall asleep again. Well, that's my wife, Wanda. When she was a teenager, she said she went to a church where the minister would always preach for an hour and then have a long altar call. And she and her teenage friends had only one way to get out of there. And that was for someone to get saved. So they would take turns getting saved, and Wanda said she's been saved more times than she can remember. Well, on a more serious note, the great New Testament scholar of another generation, Rudolf Bultmann, it was German, said that in the moment of preaching, Christ stands before us and calls us to make a decision, calls us to wake up. The story of Lazarus, which we didn't read today, because we all know it, right?
Yeah. We can read it if you want.
No, you can't read it now. But you know the story of Lazarus. But the story of Lazarus is about a wake-up call. It was the spiritual writer James Findlay who captured this point and made it well. Findlay writes, Jesus bid Lazarus wake up, and Lazarus stumbling forth from his tomb is a concrete symbol, of what each of us is called to do once we hear Christ's voice. We are to stumble forth from the tomb of lethargy, blindness, doubt, duplicity, into the simple light of God's call. The story of Lazarus in the tomb is a symbol. A symbol. Well, let's take the matter of duplicity. The tomb of duplicity. You know, a duplicitous person is one who says one thing and means another. A duplicitous person is one who is inauthentic, not real. The tomb of duplicity. And by the way, politicians are not the only duplicitous people around. And so Christ calls us out of that duplicity, that tomb of duplicity, into authenticity. Or lethargy. Let's call it spiritual lethargy or indifference. Just really don't care too much, lethargic. It's sort of being a half-hearted Christian. What the lethargy is, the spiritual state of lethargy is, it's kind of half-hearted. Well, I'm a Christian, well, but not today. Sort of half-hearted. I never forget the story that a professor of preaching told to us in a class years ago. He said there was this man who was an Episcopal layman, member of an Episcopal church, and he said that one night he and his wife went to see the play Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. Now, you may remember the story of Death of a Salesman. It's about Willie Loman. And Willie Loman was a salesman, although Miller never says what he sold. He was a salesman. And Willie was having a difficult time in his sales life. He might go to a store, they would accept his product, or they said, we're going to get rid of your product. But Willie had a vision. And his vision was that if he could become wealthy and popular, he would be happy. He would be happy. But the business was going bad for this salesman, for Willie Loman. And he also had 2 sons. And things were going bad in the family. Willie and his 2 sons just didn't get along. And his wife and the mother of the 2 boys would say to them, and they were adults, attention must be paid to your father. One evening, Willie was home in a melancholy mood. And he began to think. He had a plan. He had hope. He knew what he could do. He said, I have a life insurance policy, and if I were dead, my family would get that life insurance policy and the money, and they would be happy. Willie was somewhat deranged. But Willie, thinking about that life insurance policy and his plan, he ran out, got in his car, drove off in a fit of speed, and you hear a crash. And Willie's dead. The death of a salesman is a grim and bitter story about meaninglessness and emptiness. There's another play, another story about that Mitch Albom wrote called Tuesdays with Maury. Wanda and I heard Mitch Albom's story about Maury. Albom was a student of Maury's at a university, and Albom learned that Maury was dying of ALS, the Lou Gehrig disease, and that Maury had only several weeks or months to live. And so each Tuesday, Albom would go and visit with his old professor about life, death, and destiny. That story was also made into a play, which Jewel Box Theater performed, and Juan and I were there for that, and again, it tugs at you, and you hear a call. It's like the voice of Christ coming through Arthur Miller's play to that businessman who woke up. It's like Tuesdays with Maury's. It is a call from Christ. Now, Marcus Borg, the late Marcus Borg, has a sermon on hearing the call of God's voice. And Borg mentions in this sermon that he has known people who have heard the call of Christ. Not through the ears, but they've heard it. And also in the New Testament there are those calls, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? But Borg goes on to say, well, you don't have to directly hear the voice of Christ. It was like that Episcopal churchman who, through the story of Willie Loman, heard the call of Christ and became involved in his church. It's that kind of call. And so Borg says, well, just look at your daily life for the call. A number of years ago, I was senior minister of a church, Well, I wasn't really the senior minister, I was the only minister. And one day I came down with the flu or something, and I was off work for a few days, and after I got back amongst them, why, this one layman said to me, he said, well, Jeff, said, you probably need to lie flat on your back and look up for a change, you know. Well, he didn't mean God sent me the flu, but he meant, you know, in the circumstances of your life, sometimes you may look up. This past week, I had a strange thought, thinking about my own life. And I thought about the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, that's that piece of legislation that gives us handicap parking. It's that legislation that requires certain changes in restrooms to make them handicap accessible. And so I was thinking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I thought of the terms invalid and invalid. You know, it's the same word. An invalid can become invalidated. An invalid can be cast aside. And I thought of the Nazi era, when those of us with walkers and canes would have been put to death. And then I began to perceive that the Americans with Disabilities legislation was the call of Christ to value human beings. Sort of a call, something to think about. Well, you know, societies get in ruts and they lose touch with what's really important, but so I want to say that when you see a sign says, you know, parking for the disabled, that we've used quite a bit, that's a call. That's a call from Christ to be sensitive to the needs of others. And we get in a rut. Well, what is a rut? You know what a rut is, don't you? A rut is a grave with both ends out. What a rut is. And you know, churches can get in ruts. I remember, and I was told some of you this, my first church I served in upper state New York, right out of seminary. The church wanted to grow, and so we started to do some things that brought some people in. And one Sunday, an elder came over to me and said, "Now, Jeff, who are these strangers?" And I didn't have the presence of mind or the insight or whatever. And I should have said to him, well, they're wake-up calls. They're Christ speaking to us. And, you know, do you all remember, maybe you don't, but in our congregation over a year ago now, when we began to talk about renewal efforts, we came on to the biblical image, and one of the images we came up was the story of Lazarus. And all of a sudden people said, well, you know, Jeff, I don't think we need that kind of story because that guy Lazarus was dead. Well, it's true. So we're not going to be the Lazarus Project. But we missed it, didn't we? We missed the point. The Lazarus story is about a wake-up call. A wake-up call. And we want to be the congregation awake, right? Well, we are. You know, I think over the last year or so, we've become more sensitive to each other. We've become more caring for each other. We've become more caring for the community. And our bicycle ministry has awakened Oklahoma City to the plights of the homeless and the needs. We're awake. And you know, they wanted to close Edgemere School. And we are partnering with Edgemere School. And John has spent countless hours working with Edgemere School. And they're not going to close it because of people like John and this congregation. And that's a wake-up call to this community. We're awake. Story is told of the Buddha, who was walking along a road one day, and three affable chaps saw him, and they came over to the Buddha and they said, Buddha, we want to ask you a question. And the Buddha, of course, was into questions, and so, yeah, it's fine. So one of them said, Buddha, are you an angel? And the Buddha said, no. Well, are you a great holy man? And the Buddha said, no. And they said, well, are you a prophet? And the Buddha said, no. Well, what are you? He said, I am awake. I'm awake. Well, maybe that tenacious spirit of the Buddha be ours, so that we are ever sensitive to the voice of the Christ who calls to us from outside the tombs of our lives. Amen.